Trump versus Musk on debt. Should America borrow and spend even more, or tighten its belt and perhaps even start paying some debt back? US national debt. What all of you owe. What politicians have borrowed in your name for you to pay back. $36 trillion. But it's worse. That doesn't include state and local government debt and unfunded pension liabilities. They're debts too. If we include those, as we should, the real US national public debt is more like $43 trillion. $43 trillion. That's hard to visualize, but let's try. You know those movies where the chap comes in and he's got a suitcase full of $2 million, which he's going to use to buy the uranium rods or pay the ransom or whatever it is. That's good. You can visualize $2 million in the suitcase. But $43 trillion, what would that look like? Imagine counting out the US public debt in $100 bills, new thin $100 bills. How high would your stack of $100 bills be? Would it be 1,000 feet high? Would it be 20,000 feet high? Would it be 50 miles high? If you counted out the US national debt in $100 bills, your stack would be almost 30,000 miles high. That's 120 times higher than the International Space Station. Or to put it another way, suppose you try to chuck out of the window the US national debt, silly thing to do, at a rate of $100 a second, no breaks, all day, all night. How long would it take you? Would it be 5 years? Would it be 100 years?
Wow.
To chuck the US national debt out of the window at a rate of $100 a second, it would take you 13,500 years. In other words, if you'd started chucking the debt out about 8,000 years before the invention of writing, you still wouldn't have finished. Or if you prefer, if you lined up the national debt in $1 bills all in a row, how far would it stretch? It would stretch from Earth to Neptune, the most remote planet in our solar system. And in fact, it would carry on for another billion miles or so. It is literally astronomical. But they say, governments do borrow large sums from time to time. That just happens. That's true. To fight World War II, America borrowed $211 billion. In other words, today's US government debt is 200 times bigger than the debt required to fight and win the Second World War. But you say, inflation. Well, if you adjust for inflation, back in the 40s, the US borrowed just $4.8 trillion to fight World War II. So in real terms, we've taken on about 9 times as much debt as was needed to fight World War II. Since the 1960s, the US debt has gone from almost nothing to its current gigantic levels. And a huge amount of that debt has been taken on just in the last 20 years. But I say debt, is it really debt in the normal sense of the word? When you or I borrow money, we have to pay it back ourselves. But when a politician borrows money, it's not the politician that has to pay it back. Politicians have a clear interest in borrowing as much as they can to spend buying votes and popularity, and then presenting the bill to us, as it happens, after they've left office. But it gets worse. Debt is a form of taxation, deferred taxation. Politicians borrow and spend now, we pay back later. Much of the debt we'll pay back a lot later, so much later that it won't be us paying it back. And there's one problem. Effectively, Americans are sponging off their children and grandchildren, who are the ones who will have to pick up the tab. Trump wants to spend our children's money now. Toddlers of 3 and 4 will be paying for Trump's big beautiful bill in 30 years' time. This is immoral and sordid. It's also undemocratic. We're taxing our children without their democratic consent. Remember the old no taxation without representation? That's exactly what's happening. But there's something else. Trump and his fellow socialists seem to believe that insane amounts of government spending is the route to economic success. This is one of the biggest economic myths of the 20th century and has led to economic disaster time and again. But it's an error, or perhaps crime, that politicians commit again and again because it buys them popularity, albeit fleeting, but enough to stay in power a few more years. Politicians have been spending our children's money to buy our votes. Is that debt or theft? The politicians say, but the children will benefit from all the wise investments we're making with their money. Just think of all the infrastructure we can build. Infrastructure that they will enjoy and thank us for. Well, you can build a lot of pretty wonderful infrastructure with $43 trillion. For example, that's enough to rebuild the entire interstate highway system 150 times over. It's enough to rebuild all of America's public hospitals 350 times over. It's enough to cover the continent with high-speed rail track and nuclear power stations and everything else you could possibly imagine. So what have they done? What have we got for our $40 trillion? 20 years ago, there were around 1,300 public hospitals in the US. Today, having spent $40 trillion, there are only 1,100. 20 years ago, there were about 97,000 public schools. Today, there are about 98,000 public schools, an increase of roughly 1%. Trouble is, the population in the US in that time has increased by more than 17%. So we have far fewer schools per head of population. In the last 20 years, the number of roads and the number of bridges have increased by about 5%. Again, far behind the growth of population. In the past 20 years, the US government has built about 150 miles of railroad track. Bear in mind that in just 2 decades in the late 19th century, America built about 115,000 miles of track. The number of nuclear power stations in the US has actually decreased from 104 to 94. There's an international league table which measures competitiveness, which includes quality of infrastructure. 20 years ago, the US was in 5th position. Today, it's down at 13th. Ironically, the countries in the world recognized as having the best infrastructure, Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, Singapore, are all countries with incredibly low levels of government debt. Strange that, isn't it? The shocking truth is that we've spent $40 trillion of our children's money and done nothing with it. Nothing to pass on. Nothing for which they will say, "Oh, thank you guys, that was worth spending our money on." We've spent vastly more than was spent on World War II, on zilch. This is money flushed down the toilet, down the public sector toilet. But enough moaning. What are we to do now? How do we begin to put things right? How do we minimize the damage done to the prosperity of our children and grandchildren? How do we make up for this economic and moral crime? In Argentina, Javier Milei cut public spending by 1/3. What was the result? The number of people in poverty has actually dropped by almost 10%. The economy, which was shrinking at a rate of almost 2% a year, is now growing at an astonishing rate of almost 6%. It's amazing what cutting spending will do. We obviously have to stop borrowing money. We obviously have to pay back some of this debt, surely. How much? Combined federal and state spending is currently a staggering $14 trillion a year. Elon Musk suggested making cuts to public spending of $2 trillion a year. That's pretty modest. Even if you used all that to repay debt and didn't take any more debt on, it would still take a couple of decades or more to be debt-free. But those cuts suggested by Elon were deemed outrageous. He was told to reduce his target to $1 trillion, and then even that was whittled down to a piddling $150 billion. Nothing. Doesn't scratch the surface. But it gets worse. The government has decided to carry on borrowing at a rate of about $2 trillion a year. To fund his big, beautiful bill, Donald Trump is pushing that up to $2.5 trillion a year. This is absolutely grotesque. What does America think it's doing? It's not alone, mind. There are other countries on the same path to economic ruin. But really, is this what America was meant to be about? Are these American values? What is needed in America is not cuts. It's not, oh, should we trim the budget on environmental research groups or opera companies or DEI and so on. That won't do it. What's needed is a different kind of America. A reset so profound that you have to imagine a different kind of society. The kind of society America used to be. In 1870, the entire workforce of the federal government could have fitted into MetLife football stadium 8 times over. Today, the US government, federal and state combined, employs 24 million people. But many more people are employed indirectly by government, through government funding of research groups, opera companies, universities, blah blah, the so-called third sector. How many jobs in America in total are now paid for out of government spending? Estimates vary between 35 and 45 million. That's as much as 3.5 times as many Americans as work in manufacturing. Imagine telling that to one of America's founding fathers. This is what America will look like one day. The growth in government spending of the past century has in effect created a new social class. A class of tax consumers with a direct interest in maintaining and increasing government spending, and, to justify their existence, in extending more and more the role of government. This class isn't just huge, it's also incredibly influential. These are the people who run public administration and universities and research institutes, who provide us with experts and media commentators and the like. They are the publicly funded establishment. In my next film, I'll do a deep dive into this class, who is in it, how it works, and the threat it poses to our prosperity and freedom. This is the class that obstructed Elon Musk, maligning him and undermining him at every turn. This is the class that will fiercely resist any return to economic sanity. To begin to repay America's gargantuan debt, to restore America to its older winning ways, ordinary tax-paying Americans need to come out fighting. We must recognize the existence of this obstructive, tax-munching, debt-junkie governing class and declare war on it. But more of that in my next film. I'm Martin Durkin, and this is Guerrilla Science.